model, mutations at the end of the day, they're not, construction, they're destruction. But if we actually look at, say, a real-time example, say, let's use Lenski's long-term bacterial experiment, if you're familiar with that. So we know that a very trivial adaptation happened, because what it was optimal growth on a given medium, right? But Lenski's bacteria, what they actually did was they shrank in genome size. So in other words, the functional genome, it actually decreased. So it became evident with this experiment, and they're still observing it, that the more rapid growth in these bacteria, it was actually very much and significantly accomplished through genetic degeneration. So it's actually a fact too that many useful genes, say not essential in that artificial environment of Lenski's experiment, they're actually lost, which means at the end of the day, not only are they lazy and they're handicapped in that environment, when transferred to a natural environment, those highly degenerated bacteria, they would certainly be dead on arrival. So right there is, real-time evidence of that genetic degeneration, which once again, I'm just saying is consistent with the biblical model. And I don't understand how natural selection is going to be able to stop this degradation problem. Like, do you have a solution to it? And how do you feel about the Lenski example? Are you familiar with Lenski's experiment? Go ahead.
Yeah, I've heard about it. It's been a while since I've even looked into it. But from what I understand, as far as the Lenski experiment goes, the bacteria broke off into another species, and there were like a couple generations of evolution. And so you can see over a large period of time, like 30 years of evolution, Lenski, for younger creationists, I would say he demonstrated macroevolution. He demonstrated evolution on a large scale. So that's pretty much how I understand it.
But at the end of the day, because this aerobic citrate digestion by bacteria, that was the big one that was seen. If it involves, say, the loss of control of the normal anaerobic citrate digestion, and it's sure, it's an adaptation, but it's a very much, degenerative adaptive change, that's not gonna, take your fish to fishermen. Because if we're seeing, losses of information, we're seeing genetic degeneration, that's no help to large-scale evolution. Because obviously we agreed that the word evolution means a change in allele frequency in populations over generations. But if these changes are degenerative, that's more consistent with a young Earth creation model. Because obviously there's a shelf life on these genomes if we're accumulating these mutations, right? I mean, do you understand that a neutral mutation is not selected for or against? Whether it's ERVs, whether it's nuclear DNA sequences, mitochondrial DNA sequences. But my whole point was that these phylogenetic classification methodologies, it's based on an assumption that common ancestry is true. But
can we demonstrate
we do see this accumulation of deleterious? Yeah, but the thing is, if we see a significant loss of information, loss of function, and genetic entropy, which I don't believe has been debunked yet,
it is. It's
that
not
taken seriously. It is. All it is an assumption.
So first of all, as you said, we can demonstrate common ancestry. You believe it up to an extent, like the kinds, the archetypes, or whatever, for instance. But genetic entropy isn't taken seriously by geneticists because it has failed.
Well, the thing is, I have many quotes from. I mean,
I can show you the data. I can show you I honestly, if someone says a quote about it, if I give you 100 quotes about people saying evolution is correct, you're not going to become an evolutionist.
Well,
likewise, if you send me 100
quotes... Yeah, but you're trying to say that population geneticists don't take it seriously. I mean, if you look at Alexei Kondrashov, he was the professor of evolutionary genetics at the University of Michigan. He said, why are we not extinct 100 times over because of these near neutral accumulation of deleterious mutations?
Who said that?
I think his name was Alexei Kondrashov. I don't know how to exactly say his last name. You've got Michael Lynch, who's a professor population genetics. His quote was, "Our results provide no evidence for the existence of a threshold population size beyond which a population is completely invulnerable to a mutational meltdown, mutation accumulation, the extinction in small populations. The thing is, they have to hold to their worldview, their primary axiom.
No, they don't.
Secret among population geneticists that this is a major and detrimental
It's
problem.
not, though.
I'm giving you quotes.
It's actually not, because, and here's why. Again, quotes really don't do anything, because we can show.
Quotes from population geneticists. Evolutionary.
Have you actually read the technical paper on it?
I sat and read that letters to a creationist, and none of those arguments
more
were
important.
I want to hear your best argument against these accumulation of near-neutral mutations that's degenerating our information system.
Actually, geneticists have already debunked it, because for one thing, creationists ignore beneficial mutations, which offset.
I've already told you that these beneficial mutations are rare, so natural selection may amplify the beneficial mutations and get rid of the, most, because obviously natural selection is acting on the phenotype. It's not going to recognize one single point mutation on a nucleotide. It's got to act on the phenotype as a whole. So at the end of the day, those near-neutral mutations are not selected against. It doesn't matter about beneficial mutations. It's a straw man argument. It proves that Scott guy in that letter to creationists, he didn't even read anything that John Sanford provided. Because
I'm sorry, you're going to have to say that again. You're saying a whole lot about. You were saying a whole lot at one time. For instance, let's break this concept down.
Well, let's talk about beneficial mutations. You're saying that beneficial mutations are going to counteract these accumulation of near-neutral mutations, but
which has been shown. Even the model that Sanford was basing his model on was oh crap, what was his name? Kimura. Kimura's model. He was ignoring that Kimura had pointed out that beneficial mutations would offset the harmful and near neutral ones.
The near neutral mutations are not selected for or against, because you're going to have to show me thousands of these examples of adaptation via beneficial point mutation.
Why?
Well, of course, because you even admitted that the overwhelming amount of mutations are near neutral. If you're saying that beneficial mutations are going to help with this, where are the beneficial mutations in man? Because, Jackson, it is very well documented that there are thousands of very deleterious Mendelian mutations accumulating in the human gene pool, even though there's strong selection against such mutations. So where's all the beneficial mutations in man?
I mean, I've provided you but one already, which is the apolipoprotein A1, which is beneficial. It's beneficial in the sense that it provides a selective advantage.
Loss of specificity, though.
What is Okay, so when you said specificity, what we're talking about, is this a thing that's now better at its job than it used to be? I don't know what you mean when you say it's lost specificity. It's now better.
Because I'll explain it to you.
It's better at metabolizing cholesterol than it used to be.
No, because
that's what this thing already did. This protein already did that job.
Do you want me to explain what I mean by loss of specificity? I'm saying that the fact that the person with the mutation is unable to produce the normal levels of HDLs, they're known, and you probably know this too, they're known to perform a valuable role in moving bad cholesterol. This suggests that there could be a health downside to this mutation. It's exactly like sickle cell anemia. It's exactly like the HIV. It is.
Apolipoprotein A1 is not like that at all. It's not an example of heterozygotic advantage. I have not seen any technical literature to indicate that is the case.
Well, the thing is, you can give me one or two. Obviously, we're going to agree to disagree on that one. I just showed you why it's a loss of specificity. But where are these thousands of examples of? Because we document thousands of deleterious Mendelian mutations, but we struggle for 2 hours to even agree on one solid.
Mutation. So here's what I defined: what a beneficial mutation is. It provides a selective advantage, and in this case, and it doesn't matter whether the gene, it doesn't matter what has happened to the gene per se. It is providing it underwent a mutation that now provides a selective advantage.
That's still deleterious in another. If it's polyfunctional and polyconstrained, even the smallest change is deleterious.
What does that mean? What does polyfunctional and polyconstrained mean?
Poly meaning many, functional meaning, performing many functionals in even a single nucleotide.
So how is apolipoprotein A1 polyfunctional?
I'm saying that our genome is polyfunctional.
So the whole genome is doing multiple functions?
our genome is performing multiple functions. One gene is regulating another gene. I mean, there's overlapping codes. It's the double helix. They're all interacting with each other.
Whoa, what? That's not what. Okay, the regulatory genes are doing specific jobs. You have one job. I mean, they might not necessarily have one job, but they
have multiple polyfunctions.
The point of their job is, at least one of them, is to regulate other genes. Okay, that's their job. I don't understand what you're trying to get at, because
I'm trying to say if the majority of our gene sequences are proven and shown to be functional, any change in our genome is going to be deleterious. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so and here's why I explain that it's not. Because you have examples.
I know you think you've explained that, you know, they don't perform roles, but I think it's pretty evident that they do perform roles, because
you haven't provided examples that they have. You pointed me to these ERVs over and over, which we've already agreed. The few that actually have jobs. I'm totally willing to concede that point, but the majority of them don't have any jobs.
Well, the majority of them. Okay, but
ERVs don't have any
of the deleterious mutations, are they going to display any clear phenotype? Like, let's say it's just a neutral mutation. Is it going to display any clear phenotype?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay, so natural selection acts on the phenotype as a whole. It doesn't act, you know, on a genomic level
it does.
Per se. Well, it's looking. We're all mutant. You know, one maybe more mutant than the other, but natural selection does act on the phenotype.
It acts on the phenotype and the genotype, yes, or genome.
Okay, so how come there's no beneficial, you know, birth anomalies being seen? You know, how can we see so many birth defects, but we're not seeing any, positive, outward phenotypic beneficial mutations that are as evident as these birth defects?
So, for instance, when I was referring to Ragavalia, which have duplicated these genes, they now have novel propeller fans, which allow them to invade a new environment. Is that or is that not beneficial to them? Is that not selectively beneficial?
I'm not crazy familiar with that, so even if I concede that, because to be honest with you, every example that I've seen an evolutionist provide, it has, through further research and looking into literature, provided sufficiently some type of deleterious effect. Do you believe that type of example is sufficient to say prove pond scum to people evolution? I mean, is that type?
No, that wasn't my point at all to do that. I was merely pointing out the existence of beneficial mutations. I'm not even talking about evolutionary history. I'm merely explaining how the process of evolution itself works.
Okay, if I concede that that's, you know, a beneficial.
Well, I can move on to another one then.
Okay, I'll just let's just say it is. The thing is, you know, I think I might have said this before. You need to understand that obviously a population is going to be undergoing genetic decline due to the vast numbers of slightly deleterious mutations I'm talking about, because selection can amplify this beneficial mutation. Well, you're saying selection's amplifying this beneficial mutation, right? It's amplifying it now.
In what?
In the one you just talked about with
well, no, it's not amplifying that. It's created this novel structure from these genes. The same with the notothenioid fish, was that you had a gene that had a totally different function that was duplicated. It developed a new protein and a new function.
But is that going to stop the degeneration process ultimately?
There's no degeneration process that's been observed. That's not being observed in actual real-world populations.
Okay, so you don't believe that these near-neutral mutations are degenerating our genome, right?
I didn't say I didn't agree with that. They probably are, but what I'm saying is that the genetic entropy that you're
I'm just saying there's nothing that can stop it, much like nothing can stop a rust on a car. Sorry, I had to use an analogy there.
No, that's fine. I'm not saying that near-neutral mutations aren't occurring and accruing in the genome. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that the magnitude in which these occurring is not causing genetic entropy, as Sanford would like us to believe, and as other creationists would like us to believe. That's not happening. It's not being observed in populations.
So you don't think that there's any, like, for example, RNA viruses, it's the if you look into the Spanish flu, H1N1, you know, they killed between 50 and 100 million people. By 2009, it was extinct. after 15% of its genome of 12,600 nucleotides had mutated. So it actually, and if you look at the graphs in Genetic Entropy, the book, it followed a perfect linear mutation accumulation rate and a perfect exponential biological decay curve. So that means the H2N2 and H3N2 outbreaks are now following the same decay curve. So
why don't we see that in anything else?
Now. We're seeing it in real time.
Why don't we see that in anything else? I'm not familiar with those examples, and I'm very leery of anything Stanford says because he's.
I'll send them to you.
But is anyone else aware of those examples?
Well, like I said, I've given you quotes from.
But have you yourself read the technical papers on the examples he provided?
Okay, well, look up James Crow. He's another. I've already given you 3 quotes from population geneticists.
I don't care about the quotes.
I just want to give one for the audience. I want them to hear this one. So he said, I do regard mutation accumulation as a problem. It is something like the population bomb, but it has a much longer fuse. So these evolutionary population geneticists, they are recognizing it as a problem, but they can't concede it the way we do because they have to hold to their primary axiom. They have to hold to molecules.
In fact, I would say the exact opposite, because what I see in researchers is that they are honestly struggling with the actual data that we see. And I can turn that around and say, look at Todd Wood. He said evolution is definitely true, but that he rejects it because he wants to believe in the Bible. And he's not the only one. Kurt Wise has said the same thing, and I could go on. We could look at other examples. So I don't care about quotes. I really don't. They don't mean anything. Here's yours.
Awesome, thank you. I think this has been fun. I really enjoyed the cross-examination. I didn't really see any real solid rebuttal to say genome degradation. I think that's important to explain the net loss versus the net gain, because if on a genetic level, for example, Darwin, he didn't know anything about genetics, the laws of inheritance. He certainly came from Mendel and his pea plant experiments. Look into that. That certainly it explains and reveals the evidence for our created heterozygosity model. But if there's no explanation for the genome degradation, obviously pawns come to people evolution can't be true. So even phylogenetic systematics, it's based on a primary assumption that this universal common ancestry did happen, when we know based on genetics that it couldn't have happened. Now that means a biblical based model based on the fact that genome degradation, mutation accumulation after the fall is consistent. The evidence, the empirical data is better explained through our model. And even if we look at examples of beneficial mutations, I know he gave an example of a skull, but I think even his example of the bottles there, for example, we have pre-programmed, a lot of these changes, they're non-random epigenetic changes based on the pre-existing information. So that can't be used as sufficient examples for pawns come to people evolution. And even if you look at the praised examples of beneficial mutations, whether it's African resistance to malaria, we know that's due to a broken hemoglobin protein. Melano mutation is praised as a human mutation, but we know that's a loss in net specificity. Nylon digestion by bacteria, also a loss of substrate specificity. And at the end of the day, if you're using examples of, say, adaptive immunity, homologous recombination, antibiotic resistance, and bacterial sickle cell anemia, as I said, these all fail to meet the requirements of a gain in information. And if you're duplicating an already degenerate gene, that's just going to speed up the degeneration process. And I didn't see him, address the evidence that I provided for genomic degeneration. I mean, we see it in real time. I know Richard Dawkins praises the E. coli experiment as strong evidence for evolution. I mean, we know Lenski demonstrated, and he is demonstrating reductive evolution. All beneficial mutations seen in this experiment, the reductive, loss of function, loss of promoter, loss of genes. They're painting themselves into a corner. They're handicapped, they're lazy, they're weak. They're getting rid of genes short term, but what it is it's long-term degeneration. So at the end of the day, the adaptation in this experiment, and this is a perfect experiment to look at to see whose model is stronger, it's largely accomplished by means of loss of function and loss of regulation mutations. So that's a net loss of information. That's not going to take your fish to fishermen. We see paleogenomic evidence. I mean, mammoth populations, we see that they carried an elevated genetic load. Neanderthal was highly inbred and had very high genetic load. There's a pandemic of mutation-related diseases in the human population: Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune cancers, immunological. This is entropic degeneration on all levels. Without an explanation on how to solve this, you're not going to get your fish-to-fisherman evolution, and that means it's just a false assumption based on really a lack of evidence. And even the H1N1 human version, people will say that, John Sanford misrepresented the data, but evolutionists themselves cannot explain why the H1N1 virus is extinct in humans, right? Adaptive evolution does not cause extinctions. And the virus started off more human in its codon usage and ended up randomized. It became worse at interacting with human DNA over time. So if it is using the wrong codons, that means it will be less efficient at replicating in human hosts. So this is a decline in functionality and matches exactly with genetic entropy. So the amount of evidence for genome-wide degradation for John Sanford's model is actually overwhelming. And more importantly, genetics confirms biblical creation. If you look at the three major haplogroups, the length of the lines on the distribution of these mitochondrial DNA variants really does show there's three independent lines of evidence that fit exactly what we see in mitochondrial DNA. That's exactly what we'd expect through biblical creation. We're seeing degeneration. Like, are you familiar, obviously, with neutral mutations?
Am I familiar with them? Yes, the vast majority of mutations are neutral. They don't do anything. Although they can come to have function, as in the case of the codfish. It had neutral mutations in this section of DNA, but eventually it came to express this new function. Same with bacteria. You can replace their promoter sequences with 100 base pair sequences, and within a few mutations it becomes a functional promoter sequence.
But aren't we seeing, say, with the ENCODE project, that most nucleotides, they're playing now a role, say, in multiple overlapping codes? So that means the beneficial mutations that we were kind of talking about earlier, which are not, say, deleterious at some level, aren't they vanishingly rare? How often do we see it? Because obviously the majority of mutations, like you said, are neutral, and I agree with that. Are the beneficial mutations, the ones that would be amplified, say, by natural selection, are those more so rare?
Are they rare? Yes. Both harmful and beneficial mutations are more rare than neutral mutations, because the code is, because a large portion of our code doesn't do much of anything, and because even the amino acids that are important to us are called redundant or degenerate. Which sounds very malicious in my opinion, but that's one of the words that describe them.
But the thing is, we're seeing
hold on. Well, okay. I want to explain why this is important. Mutations are often neutral, not just because of this large portion that doesn't do anything. They're also neutral. Mutations are neutral because of a redundant amino acids code, because you can have a whole bunch of different sequences that specify the exact same amino acid. Leucine, I think, is specified by 6 different sequences. And so, if you were to change one of the nucleotides in the codon specifying leucine, then you might just change it to another form of leucine, or to another codon for leucine. In which case, you still got leucine. Nothing changed, and so that's why the vast majority of them are neutral.
But the thing is, we're seeing now that a lot of these, say, redundant genes or regions, these, I guess, junk DNA, which would constitute a bunch of different things. We're actually seeing that they play important regulatory roles. We see that they're playing roles in even embryological development, gene expression. So we're actually seeing that the vast majority of our genome is functional to some extent, which would indicate that these neutral mutations are actually more near neutral, which means they are deleterious. We're losing information. So the best way I could put it, the bottom line is that, selection, it's going to remove only, say, the worst deleterious mutations and then amplify only the best beneficial mutations. So the best way I could put it is, this means that the accumulating damage is largely invisible, because natural selection, it's not really going to act on these near neutral mutations. They're unselectable, kind of like rust on a car, while adaptations tend to be highly visible, like antibiotic resistance. So even if you, Jackson, say, present me with I don't know, even 1,000 examples of, say, adaptation via beneficial point mutation, whatever it is, you're still failing to address the key issue, which would technically be net gain versus net loss. Because adaptation, obviously, it explains the fine-tuning of the environment, because that's what we're looking at, is fine-tuning. But it doesn't really explain the astounding internal workings of life in general.
Okay.
It does not begin to explain the mystery of the genome.
Okay.
DNA discussion, would be, are mutations neutral or are they near neutral? So it's like, if we look at these tiny mutations that I'm saying are,
that's fine.
I'm saying if they're near neutral, and let's say an animal has a harmful near neutral mutation, okay? Obviously it's not going to die out because that mutation is not big enough to be noticeable. So now that animal, I just want you to follow me with this story. It's more of a story, or hypothetical. That animal now lives on to reproduce, say with its offspring also acquiring that mutation. Obviously, if it affected the reproductive cells. But now those offspring not only have the mutation it got from its parents, but, and we said this in our last discussion, 100 to 300 entirely new near neutral mutations.
140 approximately in humans.
So let's say that. So that means these near neutral mutations are going to spread throughout the entire population. And when enough time has, say, gone by or elapsed, they will accumulate to the point where the whole population dies out. And that's what I mean by genetic entropy. It all comes back to whether these mutations are neutral, near neutral. Go ahead. What do you think about that hypothetical?
Yeah, that's not even theoretically possible. I mean, it's not even possible in theory.
If you don't think that genetic entropy is possible or a problem, how come you guys always have to invoke natural selection, and especially natural selection stronger in the past? So you're admitting if there's no natural selection or if it's not working effectively, then this problem known as genetic devolution is an issue, though, right?
So firstly, if you're saying that even if there's no natural selection, even if you had a like single-celled organisms that were all immortal, right, and nothing, they had no death from natural causes, they had no predators, and they had infinite food resources, right? There'd still be selective pressure in this case for whichever one breeds the fastest. Okay, so you can't, on a theoretical level, not have natural selection. Natural selection is a necessity. It is.
I agree. I totally.
It is literally impossible.
I totally agree with that.
Okay,
I'm just saying, if you don't believe genetic entropy, I'm just saying, if you don't believe genetic entropy is a problem, then why are you always invoking natural selection as the rescue device?
Okay, so you can't say that we're always invoking natural selection if you also agree that natural selection is a absolute necessity in the system. The fact that it must exist within the system means it must be considered for all relevant topics, right? You can't ignore this thing that must exist in the system. That's like saying there's got to be wind in a system, but we can just ignore it when we're trying, to I don't know, like shoot a rifle, right? We're gonna, have long range shooting. Well, there's got to be wind, right? Even if there's no wind, you still have to consider wind, right? Because if you don't, it's not going to work so well, is it? Right? So
I understand what you're saying, but I'm just saying that it seems that you think as long as natural selection occurs, which I agree, it occurs, it's very important, as well as beneficial. I just want to finish this, as well as beneficial mutations. The problem, though, that it doesn't seem like you're understanding is that I agree a population can be undergoing this genetic decline due to the vast numbers of slightly deleterious mutations, even while this natural selection may be amplifying a handful of, say, beneficial mutations. But even though a species can undergo these minor adaptive, fine-tuning situations to its environment, it's still degenerating in many other ways. It's just like a car. I mean, you can change the windshield wipers, change the brakes, change the tires. Doesn't mean the car stopped degenerating. It will degenerate over time, just like our genomes, personally and population-wise. Go ahead.
Right. So you've just made a claim with no evidence, and I don't think you even realized you did it. Anyway, so if natural selection must exist within the system, and if therefore it must be considered when discussing the system, then talking about why it is that natural selection necessarily means that genetic entropy will not happen isn't invoking natural selection as a rescue device. It's doing what you have to do, because if you don't consider natural selection in a system that must have it, you're an idiot, right? Like, you have to consider natural selection in a system that has natural selection. How could you not? And if a necessary consequence of this thing that necessarily exists is that there's no genetic entropy, guess what that means? It means Sanford's wrong. Now, if you want me to explain why natural selection necessarily means that genetic entropy doesn't happen, I can do that.
Well, no, because I'm saying that, and I'm sure you understand, and maybe you're misrepresenting. I understand natural selection is important, right? Because adaptation or natural selection, it's going to explain fine-tuning to an environment, but it's not exactly going to explain how these near-neutral mutations can be removed, because obviously a neutral mutation is not recognized by natural selection because it's neither beneficial nor detrimental. And I want you to answer that and explain what you're about to, but I want to also address what you said about the evidence, because if we actually look at, say, Lenski, he's actually revealing clear evidence of genetic degeneration, because in this artificial environment and based on these adaptations, they're actually being accomplished by means of either a loss of function or even a loss of regulation mutation. So hence, obviously, a loss of information. So that means these E. coli, which he's done many generations of, so this would be a good experiment to look at, it involves these functions that are actually not even relevant to the static artificial environment of Lenski's experiment, which means that these bacteria are actually getting lazy. So if you actually look at that over hundreds of years, Lenski's evolving, and I say that very loosely, strains of bacteria must logically go extinct. Obviously, if he maintained the artificial environment that long, but that's clear proof right there, because nearly neutral deleterious mutations will inevitably cause this bacterial genome to rust out, and we're actually seeing that now. So we're actually seeing the opposite of evolution, which he wanted to show. So that's a real-time example of it happening.
Actually, we're seeing the exact opposite of that, and I'll tell you why. It's because those mutations that you're seeing are beneficial in the context of the bacteria that are growing there.
Look in the side.
No, because these evolving strains are degenerating toward the point where they can only grow in a specific, extremely limited, and entirely artificial environment.
Yeah, but they grow really well there. So that is not a harmful thing for those bacteria.
No, because these strains are becoming increasingly disabled and will be increasingly unfit to survive in the real world. So
Who cares? They're not in the real world. They are in the environment they're in. All that matters is whether or not it's beneficial in the environment you're in. Saying that it's like saying that, well, okay, so this mutation that makes you bigger and stronger is really a bad thing, because it'd be harmful in an environment where you needed to be smaller and weaker. What?
No, because
Nonsense.
It's not nonsense at all, because the fact that they're becoming increasingly disabled, and even while a handful of loss of function mutations have been demonstrated, I didn't say I disagreed with that, say to increase adaptation to this environment, they're greatly outnumbered by other mutations that have been accumulating relentlessly apart from selection with no visible effect. So I've given you a clear example of adaptive degeneration, or you can even call it inductive evolution. It's a form of genetic entropy. You can deny it all you want, but there's your real life, real time.
I certainly misheard you, and I apologize for that, because you said that they were observing a bunch of mutations that were causing them to no longer to no longer be able to survive in other environments, which would mean that they would be more adapted to the environment they're in. which is a good thing. But if you're actually saying that there's just completely neutral mutations that are accumulating, then that's not making them more degenerate. That's irrelevant because they're completely neutral.
Okay, so can you make predictions then, say based on your rescue device right now of natural selection? Because how strong does natural selection have to be in the past to say account for what we observe and know about these near neutral deleterious accumulation of mutations today? Because you're invoking natural selection, so how fast did it have to be in the past, and are you willing to put that on paper and make that prediction? Go ahead.
I don't know what you mean by how fast would it have to be.
Well, how many of these near neutral mutations would natural selection have had to act upon and actually eliminate in the population of these species? Because if that's the rescue device, because I've already said that I agree.
Well, the near neutral mutations would be eliminated from a population to the extent that they are actually relevant to the survival or fitness of the population within that environment. And it will, so in other words, if they are barely nearly neutral, they will be eliminated quickly.
So are there numbers, like how fast, how strong?
I don't.
What are the numbers for this?
Yeah, so if you actually go into ecology, you can find the mathematical explanation of how drift interacts with selective pressure, which is the thing that you really want to find. However, I am not an ecologist, and so while I had ecology a few years ago, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head.
Which is
However,
fine.
The conclusion of all of this is it didn't need to be any stronger at any other point in time than it is now. It's all fine.
It just sounds like a bait and switch. It sounds like a prediction cannot be made, and sure, I'll go look into it. I doubt that there is one, which would mean that it is a rescue device based on non-science.
I'll give you a prediction. You want a prediction? I'll give you a prediction.
Give me a prediction.
It would be exactly the same as what it is now.
So exactly the same.
Give or take a few percent.
Okay.
Give or take a few percent.
Okay, so let's look. So we see that an enormous 100 to 300 new mutations occurring in every person in every generation. So that means if your parents have no mutations, you have 100 to 300. Your children will have 200 to 600, and your grandchildren 300 to 900, and so on. So that means essentially all these mutations are damaging us in some way. I mean, look,
that is a claim.
They cause aging, diseases, cancer. No, you don't believe that most of these mutations are well, for one, most of them are unselectable if they're neutral. If we agree to that, that means they're invisible to natural selection. So I don't even see your rescue devices solving the problem.
If they're invisible to natural selection because they are actually neutral, then they are actually neutral, which means they're not harmful because they're neutral.
No, because it's like single rust molecules are invisible to a car inspector, but over time it will spread in the population.
Okay. Then now at that point you're making a claim that there is an actual deleterious effect to each and every mutation. That is a positive claim. Please provide your positive evidence in support of this claim. Because you can't, and I already know you can't, because it's demonstrably false, but please go ahead and do it anyway because you've made the claim.
Well, for one, I told you just based on the fact that no nucleotide by its very existence can be neutral, because we know they take up space.
Right, and I explained in detail why you were wrong about that.
No. I'm sure you gave an explanation. You know what? Even a student in school, they're going to provide an answer. It doesn't always mean that it's the right answer. The fact is, these unselectable mutations are the Trojan horse of pawns come to people in evolution. They come in silently. We know they're being so small that they can infiltrate the entire population, and they can't be removed by natural selection. So the most important part is it is consistent with our model, and you don't have to agree with it. I've already given you clear evidence from Lenski's experiment, which you want to deny. Those E. coli bacteria, they're disabled, they're weak, they're lazy, they're on their way to genetic degeneration. Okay? So natural selection is not a god, it's not a deity, it's not going to solve all your problems. Go ahead.
Just to repeat for the audience, you're saying that you can't actually support with evidence any of the claims that you've made because all of your claims are actually demonstrably wrong. I'm fine with that if that's your position, but I don't think it helps you any.
No, I actually just supported the claim with a real-time example based on Lenski's experiment.
Right.
I also
Lenski's
find it
experiment
shocking
doesn't
that you don't
support you at
agree
all.
that most mutations are deleterious. and
I
the fact
don't agree that
not
most
know-
mutations are deleterious. I think there's no evidence for that.
You don't believe that there's... So would you... 99% of mutations, you wouldn't agree are detrimental in a way to an organism?
I don't see the evidence to support that, no.
So you can actually even see with RNA viruses, I think it was the H1N1 when it entered the human population, I think it was 100 years ago. It did cause the death of 50 to 100 million people. These viral samples were collected over the decades, and those genomes were actually sequenced during the last 10 years. When they reconstructed it, they noticed that these the original strain to all the subsequent genotypes of the next strains, they were actually degenerated, and there was a declining fitness. So it actually led to the eventual strain disappearance. I think it was in 2009, after more than 10% of the viral genome had mutated. So those are another example of a real-time, I guess, evidence of genetic entropy. So there's two evidence. I find it shocking.
So let me respond to that.
Go ahead.
So the genome size of that is 13.5 kilobase, and it has essentially 0 slack. That is extremely and completely different, and more or less entirely non-comparable to what we're actually talking about here, which is mammalian differences. Specifically humans, but also all vertebrates, all animals, all plants, all eukaryotes, and most prokaryotes, and some viruses as well, because some viruses actually have very large genomes. It's not common, but some of them do. So yeah, basically you're comparing apples to oranges here.
Well, I would disagree.
I'm sorry. Anytime somebody says, "Oh, you want to know why that thing won't work in people?" Well, let me tell you about an example from a virus. I really have to wonder about how much understanding they actually have of biology.
Which is fine. You can have the audience go look up those examples, and they can decide for themselves. But how come there's a huge increase in genetic-related diseases if this genetic entropy isn't actually true? Like, have you looked at the database of actual, even based on pure point mutations? I mean,
because we started working on making sure people who had these things don't die right away.
But the actual list of these, I mean, there's so many diseases, whether it's autoimmune diseases, whether it's point mutation related diseases, gene duplication related diseases. I mean, they're just on the rise, they're increasing, and a lot of them have no diagnoses, they have no treatment, and they have no I should say much research backing the pathophysiology of these.
So you're saying that there's no evidence that they're genetically related at all?
I'm saying that, well, I think we can agree that mutations such as point mutations, gene duplications, they do and are the result of many. Are you disagreeing that we're seeing a rise of genetic related diseases?
Okay, look.
I'm saying I don't know that it's evidenced by what you've just said, no.
Well, obviously, if we're accumulating... Athena, go ahead. What were you going to say, brother? I would say one of the strongest evidence for the young Earth creation view, and I'm not too sure if you're familiar with it. I imagine since you are a former young Earth creation, you are. But I'd have to say that it's genetic entropy, right? Like on a biological level, that accumulation of, say, those near neutral and very much deleterious mutations over time, because we know that neutral mutations, they're obviously not, recognized. They're kind of invisible to, natural selection, because neutral mutations are obviously neither beneficial nor, harmful. So if those are building up, in our genome and we are slowly degrading over time, to me, that sounds consistent with, say, the biblical fall. But it seems to me that it's inconsistent with, say, pond scum to people, bacteria to biologists, evolution. Like, how do you feel about that, science enthusiast?
So, as far as the genetic entropy argument works or goes, I would say it shows a little bit of a misunderstanding of entropy. So, actually, if you don't know, I used to. So, shortly after my whole, you could say, new birth, when it came to accepting evolution, I was a science teacher, and so one of the things I taught was physics. And when it comes to entropy, yes, everything in the universe is, you can say, going through this entropic state. Everything is going towards decay. But with the Earth and planets that are close to it, close to the sun is feeding energy into the Earth. That's why we have things like photosynthesis and plants growing and stuff like that. It's the sun that actually makes that argument of genetic entropy null. You would be correct if the sun was not feeding energy into the sun, but because that is the case, there isn't this thing of genetic entropy. Thank God, because we have the sun feeding energy into our system, and so that's what I would say against that.
So I think, okay, so if we look at, say, the first law of thermodynamics, right? The law of conservation of, say, mass and energy. Would it be accurate to define it as, say, energy obviously cannot by itself be created nor destroyed? Obviously, energy can be changed, from one form into another, but obviously the total amount always remains unchanged, right? The fact that matter is, just another form of energy, that still applies obviously to that basic rule and law of the first law. Would that be an accurate portrayal of it?
Right, sure.
But then, okay, so now for the second law of thermodynamics, you're saying the law of increasing entropy. So obviously the energy available, kind of like to reiterate what you said, for, say, useful work in a functioning system tends to decrease. Even though based on the first law, the total energy obviously remains constant. But so obviously we agree on the first and second law of thermodynamics, but I think on a biological level, the word entropy, we're using it differently, right? We're just using it in its general term to mean, decay, going, say, downhill. And on a biological level, I'm just talking about that mutation buildup, right? So I'm not really talking about the second law. So I understand what you're saying, and I'm in agreement with that. But the word entropy in regards to our genome, I'm using it in a totally different context. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm not aware of genetic entropy of any kind. That's kind of something that younger creationists use a lot. But like I said, so because the sun is feeding into the system, because the sun is feeding into the Earth, you don't have this thing where our genome is decaying over time and et cetera, et cetera. You would be right if the sun weren't feeding us energy, but that is the case.
And I understand what you're saying. I think when it comes to the entropy that we're talking about in regards to closed system versus open system, the sun's energy, making its way into the Earth, that's totally different, because instead of using the word entropy, I can certainly use the word genome degradation, because what I'm referring to is those near neutral mutations. Say, because we know that 100 to 300 mutations per person per generation, they are unselectable, right? Because they're neutral. Now, if natural selection can't, say, select these out, if natural selection can't remove these, much like a single rust molecule is invisible, say, to a car inspector, the rust will slowly, invade the car and deteriorate the car over time. Just like these near neutral mutations, the accumulation of them will degrade the genome over time. So sure, I'm using the word entropy, but I can certainly use the word degradation. Like if those neutral mutations aren't recognized by natural selection and selection can't remove them, how is this, genome degradation problem going to be stopped? Go ahead, science enthusiast.
Yeah, so it's not a thing where I would say our genomes are degrading because of mutations. So mutations actually are not a bad thing. So when you think about things like different insects, how different insects are more geared towards their environment than others. Some insects or animals are different colors and different shades of green and blue, etc. It's the randomness in that mutation or in those mutations that allow for those things to happen. So it's not a bad thing. For example, like how we have different skin colors and how we have different like I just said, different colors. Those things are only allowable if we even have mutations to begin with. So mutations aren't a bad thing. Mutation just means random, and when I say random, I don't mean it in the sense where it doesn't have any purpose. That's not how scientists use it. When I say random, I mean unpredictable. So these are unpredictable mutations. They can't be predicted. They're highly unpredictable, and these mutations allow for random things. Or they allow for different things to happen.
And I understand what you're saying, and I'd be in agreement with that. I think if I could put it and explain it better, and kind of just to reiterate a lot of what you said. Obviously, we agree that when living things reproduce, they're making a copy of their obviously DNA and they're passing it on to their offspring, right? But obviously, these mutations, which I would just say are typographical errors, they're mistakes when they occur. I would say that if it's, say, a neutral mutation, which isn't actually recognized by natural selection, that means they're going to build up in the genome. So on a personal level, it's going to build up in our genomes, but on a population level as well. So based on, say, that downward spiral, eventually, based on that accumulation of unselectable mutations, it's going to be unstoppable, because obviously natural selection, it can't choose between, say, fit and less fit, because if we're all technically mutant, some may be more mutant than others, that means the population is going to descend into, say, sickness and eventually extinction. So I'm just wondering, because I agree with what you're saying about random mutations, changes, but I'm just saying if these neutral mutations cannot be selected for or against, and they're slowly building up in the genome, much like rust builds up on a car, because a single piece of rust doesn't affect the fitness of a car. Just like a single neutral mutation, say a point mutation on one nucleotide, it's not going to affect the fitness of the car, but it's the spread of them over time. That's what degrades the genome, much like the rust degrades the car. And I think that's consistent with the biblical model. I guess my question would be, how is natural selection gonna stop this problem if we're all accumulating 100 to 300 new mutations every generation? Go ahead.
So yeah, mutations wouldn't be the problem. A better way to, I guess you could say, formulate the argument is we haven't seen that with mutations, but we have seen stuff like that with viruses and diseases, or for example STDs. For example, about 4 months ago, there was a guy in Egypt, I think, he got super gonorrhea from a very adventurous night he had with a prostitute. And he goes to the doctors and he tries to, get cured, and the gonorrhea evolves and it changes, and they give him more antibiotics and the gonorrhea changes. And so we don't see that with mutations, but we do see that with viruses and different diseases. So if you were to argue that, you would actually be correct. Nobody's denying that. But as far as mutations, I don't think that's how it works.
I guess I would say that, in my model, mutations at the end of the day, they're not, construction, they're destruction. But if we actually look at, say, a real-time example, say, let's use Lenski's long-term bacterial experiment, if you're familiar with that. So we know that a very trivial adaptation happened, because what it was optimal growth on a given medium, right? But Lenski's bacteria, what they actually did was they shrank in genome size. So in other words, the functional genome, it actually decreased. So it became evident with this experiment, and they're still observing it, that the more rapid growth in these bacteria, it was actually very much and significantly accomplished through genetic degeneration. So it's actually a fact too that many useful genes, say not essential in that artificial environment of Lenski's experiment, they're actually lost, which means at the end of the day, not only are they lazy and they're handicapped in that environment, when transferred to a natural environment, those highly degenerated bacteria, they would certainly be dead on arrival. So right there is, real-time evidence of that genetic degeneration, which once again, I'm just saying is consistent with the biblical model. And I don't understand how natural selection is going to be able to stop this degradation problem? Like, do you have a solution to it? And how do you feel about the Lenski example? Are you familiar with Lenski's experiment? Go ahead.
Yeah, I've heard about it. It's been a while since I've even looked into it, but from what I understand, as far as the Lenski experiment goes, the bacteria broke off into another species, and there were like a couple generations of evolution. And so you can see over a large period of time, like 30 years of evolution, Lenski, for younger creationists, I would say he demonstrated macroevolution. He demonstrated evolution on a large scale. So that's pretty much how I understand it.
But at the end of the day, because this aerobic citrate digestion by bacteria, that was the big one that was seen. If it involves, say, the loss of control of the normal anaerobic citrate digestion, and it's sure, it's an adaptation, but it's a very much, degenerative adaptive change, that's not gonna, take your fish to fishermen. Because if we're seeing, losses of information, we're seeing genetic degeneration, that's no help to large-scale evolution. Because obviously we agreed that, the word evolution means a change in allele frequency in populations over generations. But if these changes are degenerative, that's more consistent with a young Earth creation model. Because obviously there's a shelf life on these genomes if we're accumulating these mutations, right? I mean, do you understand that a neutral mutation is not selected for or against?
I've never heard of a neutral mutation, but yeah, define it for me.
So a neutral mutation is it's neither beneficial nor harmful. Okay, so it's slightly deleterious on a genomic level, right? Like if you have a point mutation on, say, just one single nucleotide, sure, it's not going to be noticeable, on a phenotypic level. But on a genotypic level, it is slightly deleterious because you're still messing with the message. So natural selection acts on the phenotype, not the genotype. Therefore, it's not going to recognize that mutation. So over time, these mutations, because we actually accumulate 100 to 300 and pass that on to, as long as it's in the reproductive line, we pass that on to the next generation. So as generations go on, they build up, much like rust builds up on a car, and we slowly degenerate. So if you take that back to a point of least genetic entropy, that'd be a point of creation. But that would have to go back 6,000 years ago, because based on what we know about the accumulative damage, it can't go back, say, 200,000 years ago, millions of years ago. It's just not possible. Does that make sense?
I hear what you're saying, but as far as evolution goes, remember I'm more of a physicist than a biologist. As far as evolution goes, evolution, as I know, it doesn't teach this thing of like degradation. I do know in evolution there are trade-offs. Like for example, some dinosaurs they traded, what was it? They traded they traded walking for flight, and for example, Homo sapiens, they traded strength for intelligence. So, for example, some people say, "Oh, humans lost their strength. Humans could have been bigger and stronger, and etc." But it was a trade-off because humans got
that they're trading off like one. So, is this like a mutation that's beneficial, trading off for like what's the trade-off exactly?
Yeah. So with humans, it would be our loss of muscle mass for brain capacity.
Okay, so, but obviously there's going to have to be some, so I think it comes down to like with what I'm saying in regards to genetic entropy. If you don't understand it, too much, or you're not too familiar with it, I would certainly recommend looking into it, because I think it's very strong evidence for the young Earth creation model. But I think the bottom line in regards to it is that selection that we're talking about. It's going to remove only the worst deleterious mutations, but it's going to amplify only the best beneficial mutations, right? So what that means, and this is the most important part, that means that the accumulating damage is actually largely invisible, right? Like rust on a car, like I was saying, while adaptations tend to be highly invisible. Let's say antibiotic resistance, for example, right? So that means if you, say, presented us with, 1,000 examples of, say, adaptation through beneficial point mutation, you still have to address the key issue, which would be a net loss versus a net gain? Because I'm sure we can agree that adaptation, obviously it explains the fine tuning to an environment, but it's not going to explain, that large scale bacteria to biologist type evolution, because that's going to require massive amounts of novel and meaningful information into the genome, right? But if we see degradation, it's just not possible. And that's certainly consistent with biblical creation. How do you feel about that?
I don't think that's how it works, but sure.
Well,
Yeah,
if you think about it, is if we agree that neutral mutations are not recognized by natural selection, I mean, they are going to build up. I mean, you obviously have to have an explanation for how natural selection is going to remove them, because just like rust on a car slowly builds up over time, and sure, one single rust molecule is not going to affect the fitness of the car. Over time, it will degrade the whole car, just like these near neutral mutations. And that's the whole point of calling them neutral, is because natural selection won't act upon them, right? Like, for example, I should ask you, do you agree that natural selection acts on the phenotype versus the genotype?
Yeah, I no idea what those two are. I'm more of a physics guy. But I will say, so as far as that goes, and if you don't mind, I would like to move to a different topic, because it's just kind of going in circles now. But I will say, from what I do know, as far as the whole loss of information and stuff like that, the only thing I'm trying to understand what you're saying, but the only thing I guess I could kind of relate it to,
Yeah.
is like allopatric speciation or something like that, where you have two species, and let's say there's a chasm or something where the two species can't get back together. Over time, they'll get so genetically different that by the time they come back together, they're now two different species. And that isn't necessarily a thing where, like this species is going to die out or something like that. It's just how different species are formed, and that's how you get like different rank species and stuff like that.
If you look at, say, the genetic drift that would occur in that, those mutant alleles, they're going to drift into, these new species, these new populations. And a lot of times these new species, they're created, a lot of times, say, a small heterozygous population, it's going to tend towards homozygosity. So there's actually going to be less DNA variety in that population, right? For example, a wolf to a chihuahua, they're the same kind of animal. No one's going to disagree with that. But the allelic variability and the allelic variation in the wolf is much stronger than obviously in the chihuahua. So it's still a form of information loss. It's still a form of information degradation. I'm just asking you these questions because obviously if you came out of Ponscom to People Evolution, I think it's important that you come out for the right reason, right? Because genetic entropy, I've had many discussions with scientists on my channel, probably about 20, and ones that are very familiar with this, and I'd recommend going to watch the discussions. They literally have no explanation for it. And Dr. John Sanford has done many different models in regards to these accumulation of near neutral mutations, and it really does put a shelf life on the genome. And like I said, if you look at Lenski's experiment, these bacteria, they become lazy, they become degenerate. I mean, this is consistent with the young Earth creation model of decay, degeneration, right? I mean, go ahead.
Would you say this? It seems to me the genetic entropy argument comes from the interpretation of like Genesis 3 and God told Adam and Eve they're going to die and blah blah blah. It seems more like a religious motive than a scientific one to me.
Well, I mean, it's being seen in the lab. Actually, evolutionary population geneticists, for example, Alexei Kondrashov is his name. He actually said, based on these near neutral mutations, he's not a Christian by any means. He said, "Why are we not extinct 100 times over?" So he recognizes this problem. It's kind of a trade secret among population geneticists, but Dr. John Sanford, he came out of being an evolutionist. He's still a population geneticist, but he took that trade secret about genetic entropy and this accumulation of near neutral mutations, and he's kind of exposed it, obviously, for what it was. And he's actually talked about many of the world's most prominent population geneticists, and they all agree that man is degrading. But the thing is, they have to hold to that primary axiom. They have to hold to that evolutionary worldview. So obviously, there has to be a solution out there somewhere. But for someone like me, I sit back and I think, wow, what we observe empirically it's actually consistent with the biblical model and the biblical fall, right? I mean, you can Google neutral mutation. You'll see that, natural selection, it won't recognize it. They will build up in the population. Like, I should ask you, from an evolutionary perspective, since you're talking about allopatric speciation and speciation in general, would you say that the ultimate cause of genetic change is mutation?
That can be one, and there are like 3 or 4 other factors that lead into it.
What would you say the other factors? Like, for example, the DNA, say the millions, I should say the tens of millions of DNA differences, nuclear DNA differences, mitochondrial DNA differences, say across species that we observe. Would you say that those are all based on mutation?
I honestly don't know. I'm more of a physics guy.
Well, I guess my question would be, how come you decided to give up on, the biblical model if none of this seems to be coming to you as something you've heard or understand? Because, to believe in a model of death and such as evolution, I should say bacterial biologist evolution, I don't think God would, certainly work that way through his creation. I mean, we can agree to disagree, but the empirical evidence certainly suggests that there is degradation going on in the genome. There's also decay going on in the universe. So I don't think, what would be your biggest, because I understand you're a physics guy, but if you now believe in evolution, what was it about evolution that made you think, wow, evolution is true? Like, what is it, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, there were many things. So number one of the things that was really interesting to me is that, I guess I'll ask you, when was it that you decided, or when was it that you were convinced that I guess the younger position was valid or plausible?
I was convinced based on the fact that when I looked into it, because in school I took courses on this, and I found it funny that their mechanisms of choice were in the neo-Darwinist view is natural selection, which is, it's really just means differential reproduction, right? It's a selection fine-tuning process, selects from pre-existing information. And mutations are destructive, mutations are deleterious. And I found it funny that, this is what they believe is going to take the fish to fisherman. And I looked into it, and I certainly talked to a lot of evolutionists, and I said, where's this new, novel, meaningful information coming from to take your fish to fisherman? And the answers I got and the evidence that was provided, I spent a lot of time on talkorigins.com, and the examples that were provided to me were laughable. And I thought, what I'm seeing here with these degenerative changes, they're certainly not going to take your fish to fisherman, but they're definitely consistent with a biblical model. So I haven't looked back ever since. I've studied tremendously in depth in regards to genetic entropy, mutation, accumulation. And to me, I will never look back and think, wow, evolution's true, because from what I know and what I've understood, I mean, it can't be true. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'll say, so when I looked into it, are you familiar with Seventh-day Adventism?
If you think of it this way, we have a genome of 3 billion letters, and you take out one letter, change one letter randomly. Will you have a huge fitness effect? It's going to have a tiny fitness effect. And in fact, it's like rust on a car. You can't see each rust event, but it's continuous and destructive. We have genomic degeneration on a personal level and on a population level. We pass old and new mutations on to our kids and grandkids. It's 100 new mutations per person, per generation. And nearly all non-neutral mutations are deleterious. We inherit a multitude of old mutations. Now, with this genome degradation, for numerous reasons, when it comes to rare beneficial mutations, they cannot sufficiently compensate for the relentless influx of deleterious mutations. No form of selection can stop genetic deterioration, or it can only slow it down through, say, natural selection. Now, problems not recognized by the neo-Darwinists is the limits of beneficial mutations. Natural selection is constrained by selection interference, and deleterious mutations are continuously pouring in faster than they can actually be removed. And based on what we know about the genome now, most mutations are not neutral, but are nearly neutral. Now, beneficials cannot keep up with deleterious mutations. And a lot of times you'll present examples, real-time examples of genome degradation, and they'll say, well, of course, that's inbreeding. You'd expect that. But inbreeding exposes the genetic mistakes within the genome, recessive mutations, right? Now, inbreeding, what it is it's like a sneak preview of where we are going genetically as a species. The reduced life expectancy of inbred children reflects the overall aging of the genome and reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic damage that has been accumulated. Now, the most important thing here is that genetic entropy is consistent with biblical creation. We're comparing models here. Genetic entropy is inconsistent with evolutionary theory, but consistent with the Bible, because the Bible records a time when people had extremely long lives. Now, when the lifespan of early biblical characters and their ages are actually compared, the biblical data clearly reveals an exponential decay curve. And this curve can only be described as biological. That means it must be concluded that the authors of Genesis either faithfully recorded an exponential decay of human lifespans, or they collaborated in fabricating the data using sophisticated mathematical modeling, and I find that hard to believe. Because to fabricate this data would have required an advanced knowledge of mathematics, as well as a strong incentive to show exponential decay curve. So what is the most rational and logical conclusion given the empirical data? The data is real, and human life expectancy was once hundreds of years, but has progressively declined to current values. The most obvious and apparent explanation for such declining lifespans would be genetic degeneration due to mutation accumulation. Now, a lot of evolutionists will say, oh, genetic entropy has been refuted, but it has not. And when you look at rebuttals from evolutionists, whether it's Apologia, whether it's a certain blog on the internet, Letters to Creationists, when fighting this truth, what their rebuttal will be, they'll speak of the obvious. Beneficials do happen. Selection does happen. Adaptation does happen. No one's disagreeing with this. Anybody with a basic understanding of genetics understands and knows these things. The argument of genetic entropy, genome degradation, only begins after acknowledging these obvious things. So let's look at some of the objections to genetic entropy. A lot of time they'll spend, and I know Jackson, we spent a lot of time saying that John Sanford misrepresented the data, misrepresented Camorra, but this is a rabbit trail. If you're looking at the slide here, John Sanford shows a larger zone of no selection than does Camorra because Camorra's analysis of the problem was oversimplified. The crucial issue is about defining the correct distribution of mutation effects. The vast majority of beneficials will be unselectable. Anybody can easily see that most mutations fall within the no selection zone, and that almost all of them are deleterious. So even with strong selection, the entire zone can only undergo degeneration. Now, they'll appeal to beneficial mutations. That's what it comes down to. But due to the influx of deleterious mutations, the rare occurrence of beneficial mutations cannot compensate for the information lost. Beneficial mutations are very rare. Even evolutionists agree with this. And near neutral mutations are continuously and consistently deleterious, just as you would expect with typographical errors in a text. Most beneficial mutations are too subtle to be selected for by natural selection. Linkage
Minute and a half left.
Now, if you look at the examples, thank you, examples of beneficial mutations, if you're looking here, will not compensate for the information loss. It's about net gain versus net loss. Gene duplications are almost universally deleterious, and a few rare beneficial duplications cannot offset the many accumulating deleterious duplications, let alone all the other accumulating mutations. Evolution rescue devices, synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism, not biologically real, and simulations have disproven these rescue devices. Now, evidence for genomic degradation is everywhere. Lenski, he's revealing reductive evolution. His own data still reveals clear evidence of genetic degeneration. Homo naledi, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, hobbits, all reductive evolution. Mammoth populations were highly inbred. There's a pandemic, entropic degeneration on all levels, Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, and so on. H1N1 went from a red hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event in 90 years. Linear accumulation of mutations caused this extinction. Super beneficial mutation to the rescue. Super beneficial mutations will not balance out the thousands of deleterious mutations.